My son didn't know I was watching him through the reflection in the dark screen of the television. He thought I was dozing in my chair the way I always did after dinner, the way old men do when their minds have softened and their guard has dropped completely. He thought 67 years of living had made me slow. He thought the grief of losing his mother 2 years ago had finished whatever the years had started. He was wrong about all of it. I watched him lean over the writing desk in the corner of my living room, the one where I kept my correspondence. I watched him open the top drawer, the one with the checkbook and the notary forms. I watched his hand move across a page with a practiced, deliberate stroke, and when he slid the paper back into the folder and tucked it under his arm, I understood exactly what my only son had just done. He had forged my signature on a transfer of title for my house. I closed my eyes before he turned around. I let my chest rise and fall slowly, performing the sleep he needed to see. Because the man who had just stolen my home was my son, and I was going to let him think he had won, at least for now. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to make the hardest decision of your life to protect yourself from the people you love most, hit like and subscribe, because this story is for you. The house sits on a quiet street in Kingston, Ontario, 3 blocks from the waterfront. I bought it in 1988 with money I had saved over 7 years of working as a structural engineer for a firm in Ottawa. My wife helped me choose the color of the shutters. Burgundy. She said it looked distinguished. I thought it looked like a headache, but I never told her that, and I never changed them, not even after she passed. The house is paid off. The property taxes are manageable, and for 2 years, I had been living alone in it, perfectly content, waking up early, walking along the waterfront in the mornings, volunteering twice a week at the Legion Hall downtown. I was not a man in decline. My son arrived in March with 3 carloads of boxes and his wife, and a story about the condo market in Toronto being impossible and their landlord raising the rent, and maybe just for a few months, Dad, just until they found their footing. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. I had carried him on my shoulders through every farmer's market in this city for the first 5 years of his life. I had paid for his engineering degree at Queen's, which he had abandoned after 2 years to pursue what he called real estate investment, which meant buying properties at seminars and flipping them on optimism and borrowed money. I had lent him $40,000 in 2019. I had not been paid back. I told myself it was a gift. That is what fathers do with their regrets. His wife was a woman I had never quite understood. She smiled at the right moments and remembered birthdays and always offered to help clear the table, but her eyes never matched any of it. They were calculating eyes, the kind that are always measuring the distance between where they are and where they want to be. For the first month, things were manageable. They cooked occasionally. They kept the common areas clean. My son drove me to my doctor's appointment in April when the roads were still icy, and I appreciated it genuinely. But then the questions started. Quiet ones at first. Dad, have you thought about what happens to the house if something happens to you? Dad, the financial advisor we use, says it makes more sense to transfer property before probate. Dad, you mentioned your memory has been a bit foggy lately. Do you think you should talk to someone? I had not mentioned my memory being foggy. Not once. That was the moment I started paying attention. I began leaving the television on when I went to bed, its dark screen positioned at an angle that caught the reflection of the hallway. I began keeping my reading glasses on my person at all times, rather than on the side table, because twice in 2 weeks they had moved without explanation. I began listening through the thin plaster of the old house at night, the way I used to listen for structural stress in the buildings I designed, learning to hear what was wrong before it became catastrophic. What I heard on a Tuesday night in May would have broken a lesser man. My son was on the phone in the kitchen. He thought I was asleep. He spoke in the low, urgent voice of a man managing a crisis. He mentioned a name I did not recognize, a creditor or a partner, someone to whom he owed money he did not have. He mentioned a number, $280,000. He mentioned a timeline, 3 months. And then he said something that turned my blood to ice water. He said, "The property transfer is almost done. The old man won't even know until it's registered, and by then we'll have refinanced and the bank won't question a son managing his father's estate." I lay in the dark for a long time after that. I thought about the boy who used to fall asleep in the car on the way home from hockey practice, the one I would carry inside without waking. I thought about the look on his face when I handed him the keys to his first car. I thought about how grief changes people, and how debt changes them faster, and how some people simply become unrecognizable over time. And then I stopped thinking like a father and started thinking like an engineer. Because engineers do not mourn the flaw in the design. They calculate the load, they identify the failure point, and they build the counterstructure before the whole thing collapses. The next morning, while my son and his wife were still asleep, I drove to a Tim Hortons on Princess Street and used their Wi-Fi on my phone to call my lawyer, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had handled my will and my wife's estate. I told her what I had seen and what I had heard. I told her to check the land title registry for any recent activity on my address. She called me back within the hour. There was a transfer document in process. My signature was on it. I had never signed it. Patricia told me to come in immediately. I told her to wait. She told me she was obligated to advise me that immediate action was the legally prudent choice. I told her I understood and that I needed 48 hours. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Walter, what are you planning?" I told her I was planning to let them finish digging before I showed them the hole they were standing in. She told me to be careful. I told her I had been building things that didn't fall down for 35 years. I knew something about structural integrity. That afternoon, I went to the hardware store and bought 4 small motion-activated cameras, the kind people use to watch their front porches. I mounted one in the kitchen, disguised behind a stack of cookbooks, on the open shelf. One in the hallway, tucked behind the hanging coats. One in the living room, aimed at the writing desk. And one in my bedroom doorway, angled down the hall. I linked them all to an app on the secondary phone I had purchased months ago, the encrypted one I used for my actual banking, the accounts my son didn't know existed, the accounts connected to the patent royalties. In 2004, I filed a patent for a modular cable tension system used in suspension bridge retrofits. It was something I had developed over years of fieldwork, a cleaner solution to a problem that had been expensive and inconsistent across the industry. I sold the licensing rights to an engineering consortium in 2011 for an upfront payment and ongoing royalties. The upfront payment had gone into a separate investment account. The royalties had been arriving quarterly ever since. My son knew I had a pension and a paid-off house. He did not know about the patent. He did not know about the account in Halifax with just over $2 million in it. He did not know because I had learned, very early in his adult life, that knowing about money you don't have to earn changes the way you think about money you might one day receive. I kept it separate because I wanted to know if he loved me or if he loved the idea of me dying. I had my answer now. On the 3rd night, my son came into my room. I heard the handle turn at 2 in the morning. I kept my breathing even, my eyes closed. He stood at the foot of the bed for almost a minute. I could hear him breathing. Then he walked to the dresser and opened the top drawer. I heard him move things around. He was looking for the red folder where I kept copies of the property documents. He didn't find it. I had moved it. He stood there a moment longer, then left. I heard him go to his wife and say in a low voice, "It's not in the room." And I heard her say, "Then he probably moved it. Just let the notary handle the registration and stop touching things." The next morning, I came downstairs and made coffee and acted like nothing had happened. I asked my son if he wanted eggs. He said yes. I made them. We sat across from each other and talked about the weather and the road construction on Bath Road and whether the Senators had any chance this season. He looked at me the way you look at something you've already decided to leave behind. I looked at him and thought about load-bearing walls. The gaslighting started the week after. It began with small things. My keys were moved from the hook by the door to the kitchen counter. When I mentioned it, my son said, "Dad, I found them in the freezer yesterday. You must have put them in there by mistake." I had not put them in there. My medication was rearranged on the bathroom shelf, so the pill bottles were in the wrong order. When I pointed this out, his wife looked at me with a gentle, concerned expression that she had clearly rehearsed and said, "We reorganized it because you were taking the wrong dose last week. Don't you remember?" I had not been taking the wrong dose. I have managed my own blood pressure medication for 11 years without incident. Then they turned down the thermostat and told me the house was warm. Then they told me I had called my neighbor by the wrong name, which I had not. Then his wife said she had found the stove left on overnight, and my son put his hand on my shoulder and said, "We were worried, and maybe it was time to talk to the family doctor about a proper assessment." I recognized the architecture of what they were building. I had seen it described in an article I read last winter about elder financial abuse in Ontario. They were establishing a record, a narrative of incompetence. They were building the foundation for a capacity assessment, which in Ontario can be used to apply for guardianship of property through the Consent and Capacity Board. Once a guardian is appointed, they control all financial decisions. All of them. I let them build it. I shuffled a little more when I walked. I hesitated a little longer before answering questions. I put my glasses in obvious places and then pretended to forget where I'd left them. I gave them every brick they needed, and every night I checked the cameras on my secondary phone and saved the footage to a cloud account Patricia's paralegal had set up for me. On a Thursday morning in June, a man arrived at the door. My son introduced him as Dr. Clifford, a geriatric specialist. He was a slight man with expensive shoes and a clipboard, and the apologetic smile of someone who knows what they're doing is wrong but has found a way to justify it financially. He sat across from me in the living room while my son and his wife hovered near the kitchen doorway. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. He asked me who the Prime Minister was. He asked me what year my wife had passed. He asked me to remember 3 words: mountain, 7, justice. Then he talked to my son and his wife in the hallway for 10 minutes. I watched their reflections in the television screen. My son handed him an envelope. "Doctor." Clifford put it in his breast pocket without looking at it. When he came back in, he said, "Walter, based on my assessment today and the reports from your family, I have some concerns about your capacity to manage your financial and personal affairs independently. I am going to recommend a formal review with the Consent and Capacity Board. In the meantime, your family has filed an interim application for temporary guardianship of property." I looked at him. I said, "What were the 3 words?" He paused. He had not expected that. "The 3 words," I repeated, "the ones you asked me to remember. Mountain, 7, justice." He blinked. I said, "I designed 11 bridge retrofits in this province over 30 years, Dr. Clifford. I once calculated the tensile load of a suspension cable in my head while standing in a rainstorm because a junior engineer had left his calculator in the truck. My mind is not the problem in this room." His jaw tightened. He said the assessment was based on a full range of indicators. I said I understood and thanked him for coming and walked to the front door and held it open. He left. My son watched me from the hallway with something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but lived exactly between the two. That night, I called Patricia. I told her they had moved to the guardianship application. She said the hearing was scheduled for 10 days, out at the board offices on Division Street. I told her to file our counter-motion and to have everything ready. She asked if I was certain. I told her I was more certain than I had been of anything in a very long time. She said, "Walter, you know, once we do this, there is no repairing what's been broken." I told her the structure was already compromised. Sometimes you have to let it come down in a controlled way instead of waiting for the collapse. I spent the next 3 days moving quietly and deliberately. I transferred ownership of the Halifax account to a charitable trust I had established with Patricia months earlier, a trust that directed funds to veterans' housing initiatives and engineering scholarships at Queen's University. I removed my name from every document in the house and placed the originals in Patricia's office safe. I packed a single bag and hid it under the floor of the workshop in the garage, behind the shelves of paint cans. I was not running. I was positioning. On the 7th day, my son found the camera behind the cookbooks. He came into the living room holding it, his face unreadable. He set it on the coffee table in front of me. He sat down. He looked at me for a long time. His wife stood in the doorway. Then he said, "How long?" I said, "Long enough." He looked at the camera. He looked at me. He said, "Dad, I need you to understand that we are doing this because we care about you. I said, I understand that you need me to believe that. The room was very quiet. He said, I owe people money, real money, the kind where they don't wait. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and for a moment he was the boy in the hockey car, and I felt the old pull of it, the gravity of parenthood. But I had seen the footage from the writing desk, I had heard the phone call in the kitchen, and I thought about the transfer document with my name on it that I had never signed, and the pull released. I said, You should have come to me. He said, You would have said no. I said, I would have said no because helping you disappear, a debt does not help you. It only hides the leak. He looked at the floor. He said, We can figure this out, Dad. We can stop the hearing. We can go back to how things were. I said, No, we cannot. He looked up. His wife stepped into the room. I stood up. I picked up my coat from the hook by the door. I told them I was going out for a walk, and I would be back in an hour, and dinner could be whatever they liked because I was no longer particularly hungry. I walked out into the June evening and did not look back. The morning of the hearing, I drove myself to Patricia's office at 8. I wore the suit I had worn to my retirement dinner. Patricia went through the counter documents one final time. We had the camera footage. We had the audio recording of the phone call in the kitchen. We had the bank records showing the payment to Dr. Clifford pulled from a line of credit in my son's name. We had a full neurological assessment from the Kingston General Hospital conducted 3 weeks earlier by an OHIP-covered specialist who had given me the functional equivalent of a gold star and a handshake. We had the land registry documentation showing the fraudulent transfer attempt. And we had the original patent licensing agreement and the Halifax account statements showing where my actual money had been and what had now been done with it. Patricia looked at all of it spread across the conference table. She said, They are going to walk into that room expecting a confused old man and a rubber stamp. I told her that was the plan. The Consent and Capacity Board hearing room is not a courtroom. It is a beige room with fluorescent lights and institutional chairs, and a 3-person panel seated at a long folding table. When my son and his wife arrived with their lawyer, a junior associate from a firm in Napanee who had clearly been given this file at the last minute, they did not see me immediately. They were already seated, already arranging papers, already leaning toward each other in the way of people who believe the outcome is decided. My son was wearing a good shirt. His wife had dressed conservatively. They looked like a couple who was concerned. They had rehearsed the look. Patricia and I walked in 2 minutes before the session began. My son looked up, and the expression on his face went through 5 things in the span of a second. Relief, then confusion, then recalculation, then something that might have been shame, and then a kind of flat blankness that settled over him like a door closing. His wife put a hand on his arm. Their lawyer looked at our stack of documents, and then at Patricia, and then at his own sparse folder. The panel chair, a woman with reading glasses and the measured patience of someone who has seen every version of this particular story, opened the session and invited the applicants to present their case. My son's lawyer stood and outlined the circumstances. The stove left on, the medication errors, the keys in the freezer, the assessment by Dr. Clifford. He spoke carefully and said the family was acting out of genuine concern and that the interim transfer of property management was in Walter Greer's best interest, given his evident cognitive decline. The panel chair turned to Patricia. Patricia stood. She placed a flash drive on the panel table. She said, with the board's permission, "We'd like to begin with some context." She connected the drive to the laptop provided. The room's small, wall-mounted screen flickered on. The footage from the writing desk camera was clear and steady. My son's face in close-up, bending over the document, the practiced movement of a hand that had rehearsed the signature. The timestamp was visible in the corner. The panel chair leaned forward. Their lawyer said, "Objection. This was obtained without," Patricia said. This footage was captured by the property owner on his own property using legally installed security equipment, which is entirely lawful under Ontario privacy law in the context of protecting oneself from fraud. She placed 3 printed pages on the table. The relevant case citations are included. The audio from the kitchen played next. My son's voice was unmistakable. 280,000. 3 months. The old man won't even know until it's registered. His wife's hand tightened on the edge of the table. Their lawyer leaned over and whispered something. My son shook his head, almost imperceptibly. Patricia then placed the bank records, the payment to Dr. Clifford, then the Kingston General Assessment, then the land title documentation. Then she looked at the panel and said, Walter Greer is not a man in cognitive decline. He is a man who was targeted by members of his own household for financial exploitation and responded with precision and patience. She paused. The board is being asked today to strip a competent adult of his legal agency based on fabricated evidence and a paid assessment from a physician who accepted cash from the applicants. We are asking the board to dismiss the application with prejudice and to refer the matter to the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit. The panel chair removed her reading glasses. She looked at my son, she looked at the screen, which still showed the frozen frame of his hand on the document. She looked at me. She asked if I wished to address the board directly. I said yes. I stood. I told the panel that I had spent 35 years calculating what could go wrong in a structure and building against it. I told them that the people in this room who raised the concern about my memory had moved my keys, rearranged my medication, turned down the thermostat, and told me the house was warm, and whispered things in my ear while I pretended to sleep that were designed to make me doubt my own mind. I told them I had documented every instance. I told them the physician who assessed me accepted a cash envelope in my living room in front of a camera he did not know was there. I told them that the only decline I was experiencing was a decline in my tolerance for being treated as a resource rather than a person. The room was very quiet. The panel chair called a 15-minute recess. When they returned, she announced that the application for temporary guardianship of property was denied. She referred the matter to the OPP and to the Law Society of Ontario. Regarding Dr. Clifford, she asked the BAIF to ensure that my son and his wife remained available for questioning. My son's chair scraped back. He looked at me. His wife looked at the table. Their lawyer was already closing his folder with the careful movements of someone who wants to be remembered as having had nothing to do with this. I was not looking at them. I was looking at the window on the far wall, the June sky pale and bright outside, and I was thinking about a road that runs east out of Kingston along the street. Lawrence toward the Thousand Islands, and beyond that toward the Quebec border, and beyond that toward whatever comes next. The OPP were waiting in the corridor. I heard my son's voice rise and then subside. I heard his wife begin to cry. Patricia touched my elbow and asked if I was ready. I told her almost, there was one more thing. I drove to the Kingston District Jail on Monday morning, and I sat in the visiting room and I waited. He was brought in wearing the standard issue clothes and the expression of a man who had been awake for 4 days. He picked up the receiver. I picked up mine. He said, Dad, just that. One word. I said, you should have come to me. He said, I know. I said, I am going to tell you something, and I need you to listen without speaking until I am finished. He nodded. I told him about the patent. I told him about the Halifax account. I told him the full number. I watched his face absorb it. I watched the calculation move through his eyes, the old reflex of a man who has lived his whole adult life looking at money that isn't his yet. Then I told him that the account no longer existed. I told him that as of last week, the balance had been transferred in full to a trust, directing it toward veterans' housing and engineering scholarships. I told him the house had been sold conditionally to a young family who had been renting on my street, sold at a fair price, and that the proceeds had gone into the same trust. I told him that I had kept enough to cover what I needed. What I needed was not a great deal. He stared at me. He said, You gave it away. I said, Yes. He said, All of it. I said, The parts that mattered. He was quiet for a long time. His jaw moved, but nothing came out. Then he said, Where are you going to live? I said, I'm not sure yet. I have a few ideas. I hear the Cape Breton Highlands are beautiful and reasonably priced if you know where to look, and I have always wanted to spend a proper autumn on the East Coast. He looked at his hands. He said, I'm sorry, Dad. I don't know when I stopped. I looked at him. I said, I do. I remember the exact moment. But that is a conversation for another time. Right now, you need a better lawyer than the one you have, and you need to tell the truth to whoever is helping you, because the documentation on the other side of this is thorough, and the only way through thorough is honest. He nodded slowly. I said goodbye. He said, Dad, I put the receiver back. Outside the facility, the sky was the particular shade of June blue that Ontario does right, the kind that makes the limestone buildings look almost golden. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment and did not cry. I had done my crying in February, alone in the house, when I first understood what was happening. By March, I had moved through it. By April, I had built the counterstructure. There was no grief left, or what was left of it had changed into something else, something thinner and cleaner, like the air after rain. I drove south toward the waterfront. I parked and walked out on the pier the way I had done every clear morning for 2 years. The lake was flat and enormous and utterly indifferent to everything that had happened in the last 3 months, and I was grateful for that. I stood there for a while. A woman walked past with a dog. A group of teenagers sat on the edge, with their feet hanging over the water. A ferry was crossing toward Wolf Island in the middle distance, slow and steady, and exactly where it was supposed to be. I went back to the car. In the back seat was a single bag and a road atlas, the paper kind, because I have never fully trusted devices to know where I want to go. I opened to the page showing the Trans-Canada heading east, the route along the north shore of the street. Lawrence, through the Gaspésie, across to New Brunswick, up into Cape Breton. I had traced it in pencil the night before. It looked like a good line, clean and purposeful. The kind of line an engineer draws when he has solved for all the variables and is ready to commit to the design. I started the engine. I did not check the rearview mirror. The street behind me was just a street. The house on it was someone else's now. And the shutters were still burgundy, and they would repaint them eventually. And that was perfectly fine. I pulled out onto the road and pointed the car east, and for the first time in a very long time, the only person I was responsible for was myself. And it turned out that was more than enough. If you have ever had to make a decision that cost you everything you thought you couldn't live without, and then discovered you could live without it after all, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. And if this story reached something true in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.